Hello and welcome to Beyond Organic Wine. I'm Adam Huss, coming to you from the unique vineyard at Piscinas Ranch, California. Thanks so much for listening. Joyce Jones and Charity Potter sound like the street names of Marvel superheroes, but they're actually the real women I interview for this episode. They're better than superheroes, though, because they actually live in this messy, complex, real world and take part in the real battles that result from living with the courage to speak up and ask questions and call BS when they see BS. This episode is an expose, and it focuses on the experiences and insights and conflicts and unquestioned assumptions and prejudices that Joyce experienced and continues to experience as a woman of color taking classes in what passes for wine education currently. We did not name the institution or the instructors where she takes classes because it's really unimportant. The things she experiences could and do take place in any wine education institution on any given day. I've talked a lot about diversity on this podcast. It's one of the few agricultural solutions we have to climate change. It allows us to adapt and be productive regardless of the crazy weather the year brings. It's the antithesis to our current dominant wine culture. And biodiversity is the solution to our farm's health and resilience. But equally, if not more important, is the diversity of people we include and listen to and allow to challenge our perspectives. Our mental and spiritual health is an ecosystem just like the ecosystems of our farms and forests. We cannot grow without the help of diverse connections to as many different perspectives as we can find, understand, and learn from. Joyce Jones stepped into the bubble of our dominant wine industry and popped it. Her impressions of her wine education are an incredible example of how important it is to get a fresh perspective, to include those who have traditionally been marginalized, to let down our guards and stop defending, to listen, to see our hypocrisy and self-contradictions. Though there aren't many like her, we need more Joyces in the world to keep us forever young, forever learning and growing. I want to thank Joyce and Charity for their bravery and their willingness to share their personal experiences and challenges. This is heavy lifting. It's difficult, it's lonely, and it's frustrating. And I'm not sure the wine industry deserves it, but we certainly need this help and are incredibly fortunate for these women's perspectives. I think our current wine education is laughable, or maybe cryable. It needs to be re-envisioned and redesigned from the ground up, literally. It creates and reinforces an entire structure of prejudice and exclusion that is not only cringeworthy at this point, but completely unacceptable. If anyone wants to help me build a better wine education, please email me at connect@organicwinepodcast.com. In the meantime, I'm so glad to help Joyce and Charity swing the wrecking ball through our current wine education. Joyce is a force of nature in the best sense. If you're a wine educator and you want to learn, to really learn, you want her in your class. But let me leave you all with a warning that Joyce sent me in a text. Her words, quote, "The air becomes still, reminiscent of the calm before a big storm. The sheep stop grazing and look out in the field. A shadowy figure emerges from the horizon and slowly approaches. Is it an alien? Is it the death angel? No, that would be too quick and merciful. It's Joyce Jones, and she's hungry." Gird your loins and enjoy. Joyce, Charity, thanks so much for doing this. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for having us, Adam.
Thank you. Could you guys introduce yourselves, generally just your names so we get your names associated with your voices on the recording, but also, what you do. What's your daily thing?
Okay, well, I'll start off. My name is Joyce Jones, and by trade, I am an educator in a San Diego County school. And I am very, very new to the wine industry.
Love it.
And I'm Charity, and I've been a hospitality and beverage professional for about 11 years now. I'm kind of in transition, though, wanting to get out of hospitality, and which is a big part of why I started taking viticulture and enology classes, but I still haven't figured out what I'm going to do.
Wait.
So,
You're right. You're in the transition exploration phase.
Now I'm expecting it to be like a 5-year phase.
Yeah, good. That's probably a really healthy expectation to have. Well, great. I wanted to talk to you guys because through Charity, I met Joyce. And Joyce, when I first met you, it's funny. I opened a fortune cookie at breakfast this morning. Wendy and I had fortune cookies, and my fortune cookie said, "Spend today with someone you admire." And I was like, "I'm check. I got that checked off. 11 o'clock today.
Oh,
Hanging
wow.
out, hanging out with Joyce and Charity."
Wow.
Um, but when I first met you, Joyce, you just came at me with just nonstop insights that you, as somebody who is new in wine, it was so refreshing to hear just the questions that you were asking, and then you started digging into the class that you were or multiple classes, the education that you were undergoing in wine. And this is where I thought there was like a really valuable opportunity here to get somebody who, until recently, was not like an insider wine person, so an outsider's perspective on what it's like to gain entry into wine through the sort of formal education that you've experienced, at least, and what that could potentially say about just the wine industry and wine education that we're dealing with here now already in the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. So um, just by way of getting started, what was, Joyce, specifically, what was your background in wine, and where are you now in your wine journey?
Okay, so as of let's see, 2 semesters ago, uh, I had absolutely like no background in as far as like being a drinker of any sort. But my journey with the wine industry started about I'd say about 6 or 7 years ago. Through being an educator, I am part of a work program for our high school students, and one of our business partners came to me and proposed growing a crop to allow our students to get hands-on work experience. The area where I teach is a large agriculture area, and we have a large ag program at the school,
Mm-hmm.
and so that made sense. But the person had suggested, cutting down on her property, which is about 2 acres in a residential ag area, cutting down her avocado trees and putting in a fava bean crop.
Uh-huh.
And I had just recently attended a conference, and they were talking about work readiness and talked about a small program in a nearby city, and that they were teaching students, viticulture. And that's kind of the first time I ever heard the term viticulture. And so at that conference, when the speaker talked about it, I thought, well, as soon as the business partner talked about putting in a crop, I thought, well, we're so close to that city, which means that if our students get that work experience, then they can go work in wine country, or potentially work in wine country. So I introduced her to that program. And she was very excited and wanted to go through with developing this program. And so I helped to spearhead that program.
Right on. And it's funny. I mean, it's obviously like a valuable thing in California. If we were in Montana, teaching viticulture to students might not be that valuable, but
Right.
here they actually have some legitimate avenues of employment afterwards. Did what? So what led from that to you wanting to dig deeper, rather than just looking at this as like, oh, this might be a good program for students, to, hey, I want to be a student?
Well, in the beginning of developing the viticulture program, the idea was to get students who are kind of marginalized and not exposed to a great deal of variety as far as occupational options. But then, as the program developed and became more popular, I started to see it become more exclusive rather than inclusive, which was the opposite of what the goal was. I don't know if that was done intentionally or if that's just, kind of following the way society operates and not, pushing against it. So there were a few things that happened. One, and I don't know how to say this because it wouldn't sound modest, but I'm not here to feign modesty. But really, that program was developed by me.
Right.
That doesn't mean that the founder of the program and the people involved did not work hard. It doesn't mean that they didn't have to research and learn and do things to get it going, or even spend their own money to invest before getting grants and getting funding and donations. But really, from the idea of it to designing the program and making sure that there were measurable outcomes in order to get the funding, and as well as training the person in how to get funding, how to do a work program, and training that person's staff, it was very heavily on my shoulders. But as it grew in popularity and I was being introduced along with some other people involved in the program, I was marginalized and almost dismissed. There was a lot of, oh, this person and the people that were being given credit were white women.
Mm.
And I had to show them, and even from all the documents to even getting certifications and things, I spearheaded and led that. But then when she got around to after giving a lot of accolades to the white women, and she got to me, she simply said, "Oh yeah, and this is Joyce. She told me about viticulture." And kind of waved her hand away, and that was a little shocking. But then it became infuriating as that it happened a few times again.
Yeah.
Um, and then when I looked at the participants in the program, it was very obvious that there was just one type of demographic that
Ah.
dominated. Yeah, the
So,
the participants in that program. So that's what made me think, you know what, maybe I want to learn about this and possibly start my own program.
yeah. So the next step was you looked into some local options for wine education. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. And you started taking a course. Did you do that? Maybe you want to talk about Dennis and his participation with you as well. But I mean, what was the next step in terms of taking that course and what were what was the course about that you decided to take?
So
Or the courses, I
one
should
of
say.
my colleagues at work, in the work readiness program, I was talking about the experience with the other training, with the viticulture training program. And I was saying that I wanted to possibly start my own. The problem is that I don't own land. I
Mm,
have a
yeah.
home in a subdivision, but I don't own land. And he let me know that he actually has 6 acres.
Mm,
Within about a 30-minute drive from me, and invited me to come out and take a look at it. And he said, I'm not doing anything with it. And so he was offering the use of his land, which with the other program, we were working with about 500 vines, which probably takes somewhere, in between a half an acre to an acre, depending on how far spread out the vines were. So I definitely knew that 500 vines was a lot to take care of. And so I wouldn't need 6 acres. But if he could offer up, half an acre to an acre, that would be something I'd like to look at. And in addition to viticulture, also add gardening or anything just for teaching students self-sufficiency and healthy eating, and to kind of add those aspects. So I then looked around for wine classes because I didn't even know where to begin. And I found some and then asked, would he be interested in taking them as well? And surprisingly, he said yes. And so we signed up. So for the first semester, the fall semester um, of 20, that would be, no, I'm sorry. What we're in the fall semester right now, or I don't know. They go on some weird things. The fall, so it would have been the spring semester of 2023.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, the spring semester of 2023, we signed up for a viticulture class and a wine hospitality class.
Gotcha. Okay. So both of those I mean, the two ends of the spectrum in terms of, where wine starts and where it ends, so to speak.
Yes.
Can you talk about, what was covered in those classes and some of your experiences and when you started to see things that made you begin to ask questions?
Sure. So the first course they were in the same semester, but the first class that I took was the viticulture class. And I was really excited to learn about how to grow grapevines and, learn about soil management and, I don't want to say pest management, but, bug management and all of those things.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
but I'd have to say immediately it was uncomfortable going into the class because I felt like I was walking right into the situation that I was experiencing with the viticulture program that I helped start, where, again, there was a big lack of representation.
Right. Of people, non-white
Yes.
people.
So,
Right.
yes. There were a few though. We did have someone from a native tribe, and then we had I'd say, well, because then I had my daughter come along, and then there was another woman who was Black. She was in the class. I'd say it wasn't horrible, as far as representation, but it was still very apparent that it's a kind of white dominated, as far as interest or access or knowledge about these classes. You could tell that it was more something that people from like the white demographic were more introduced or exposed to.
Right. Yeah. So,
Mhm.
I mean, there's where can we start with this class? Because
Well, let's
you
start with history.
yeah.
Let's start
Well,
with day
that's what I was going to
one.
say.
Yeah, let's start
You
with
brought up
history.
the guy who was from a local tribe,
Yes,
and you told me this incredible story about the historian that was brought in to
yes.
talk about the history of agriculture in the
Right,
area.
in that area, yes. So that was the after the introductions of why everyone were decided to take the course. Then that took up the first class, and then the second class, a historian was introduced. There were two historians, but one was known to be the expert for that area,
Right.
and the person uh, introduced him or herself, and then went on to say, I understand, that Native Americans were heavily in this area, but we're going to skip all of that. Did that kind of dismissive wave that I was familiar with when I was being introduced. So
Right.
right off the bat, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. And the person goes on to say, because I want to concentrate on when the Spaniards came.
Mm-hmm.
and went on to give, the history according to their narrative, and made mention of the young man's tribe,
Uh-huh.
and said that, the Spaniards taught his tribe how to put in place an agricultural system. And he raised his hand, and and we're talking like 1860s, or like kind
Right.
of mid to late 1800s. And he let her know that his people, and that's how he would refer, he'd say, well, I hear all the stories of my people, and we had a very intricate agricultural system in place before the Spaniards arrived.
Right.
And she
Right.
immediately said, no, you were hunter gatherers.
Wow.
Until the Spaniards came. And he was very calm, and he just explained, what has been passed down to him from his elders. And she very adamantly said that no, it was the Spaniards. And it was only until the other historian that accompanied, I'll just go ahead and say her, because there was a male and a female, when the male historian told her actually they did have an agricultural system in place, that was the only time she was willing to hear
Right.
another narrative. So it was almost, she as a white woman was unwilling to hear the story of someone from the actual tribe she was referencing, but she was willing to listen to a challenge from her white counterpart.
Right. Right.
So she then tried to, clean it up and say, well, maybe I'm just off by about a decade. Maybe there was an overlap between the time that the tribe started to learn agricultural systems and put them in place, and when the Spaniards came. And she said, maybe there was an overlap of about a decade. And at this point, she's addressing the other historian,
Right.
and he looks at her and he says, no. And she says, what about 30 or 40 years? And he says, try a few thousand years.
Right.
And at
Oh,
that point, she said, oh, well, I stand corrected. And then she thanked the young man from the tribe for bringing that up. And, but then they
right.
went back to the narrative that she's so well versed on.
Well, and
Right. Right.
here's the disturbing thing about that historian is that person's in a place to teach about the history of the area in many other certification programs, not just as a guest in the
Yeah.
class. And that narrative has not changed. And I even, anonymously wrote like how offensive some of the material was presented, and it has not been changed or addressed. It's just like, let's just
Yeah.
ignore, how these people got pushed out and how they were actually thriving agriculturally. And ironically, the oldest vineyards in this area are on tribal land, which they like to bring
Right.
up all the time, but not the history of it. And yeah.
And I mean, it just underlines the importance of having that representation that you mentioned, Joyce, because if he hadn't been in there to raise his hand and say, no, that's not true, if it was just a class full of white folks, would anybody have cared to correct her? Would have anybody even had a different narrative or known a different narrative to correct that historian? Yeah. So,
Exactly. I like, and then
and
with
that's just one example. I mean, I use
right,
that
one
like you're saying,
example,
like, yeah, like there's
because
so many
we did
perspectives that need to be
subsequently
challenged.
visit another tribe reservation with a vineyard there, and the tribal member was married to a white woman, and she took over telling the history of how the area was colonized and the brutality that happened and all of these things. But again, I was wondering, well, why does she have to tell his family's history?
Yeah.
And I had to go somewhere and just stand in the corner because I couldn't take it. I was like, what am I here for? So really the narrative, that's when I really, I'm just thinking I'm there to learn how to grow grapes. That's what I'm just here to learn how to grow grapes. But it very early on became apparent just how fiercely protective Europeans are, or European descendants are, of protecting their narrative
Mm, yeah.
on wine culture.
Yeah, it's really funny. I mean, just before talking to you, I actually commented on a an article that I was quoted in because back at the beginning of this year, I published a podcast questioning whether it was time to get rid of, or if the term "New World" was problematic, um, and yeah, it's worth listening to, and this article is worth reading to see. I mean, I'm not going to quote the article or anything like that, but what I have realized is, I think people really have gotten up in arms about getting rid of the terms "New World" and "Old World," which I think are really confusing at this point in
Mhm.
history because, and and I think what it really stems from is this definition of wine. Like the point that I made to them was, I think what we're, at the heart of this debate is not really like whether New World and Old World are accurate terms, but like, because it's only relevant if we only define wine as this thing that originates from grapes in Europe. If you expand the definition, if you, and so the, I begin to wonder, bringing this back to what you're saying, is like, when these things are happening and people are getting up in arms about some of these points, it does feel to me that it's this protectionism of a definition about wine, of an ownership of wine, of who gets to own what wine is. And it really does feel really defensive on the part of the Europeans, like it's like, or
Absolutely.
people of European descent, or people who
Absolutely.
admire and have this love of European styled wines, that it's like, no, wine is this, and da 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 da. And I'm like, well, actually, even grape wine, uh, started in China. I hate to tell you, and they have
Mhm.
a lot more different species of grapes in that part of the world than in Europe. And yeah, so I mean, like maybe it didn't start, maybe it started in multiple different places, but the oldest, record of fermented grapes is in China. So I don't even think you can talk, old world in that sense if you're just relying
Right.
on fermented
Yeah.
grapes,
How old are we talking here?
right, right. And then once you expand beyond grapes, I mean, people have been fermenting fruit all over the planet in every different culture and doing these different expressions. And it really does stem back to that thing that you found, which is like, there is, what we think of as wine, or what the idea of wine that we seem to be teaching, and that or hopefully we're challenging that. And that's what I love about your questions and everything, is this idea of it as this Eurocentric thing. Like, it's the idea of wine has been colonized. It's not just a colonial export, but even the idea of what wine can be and what it's allowed to be is a colonial thing. um I what else? Like, I mean, this was just the beginning. So I'm
Mhm.
curious, like, how did the course progress, and how did your participation how did your participation change, or what was that like as the course went along?
As again, very early on, and we have to remember this is just a semester course. So,
Right, right.
you know, um, there was again a lot of emphasis on protecting European and white exceptionalism. I felt a lot of times like I
How,
wasn't getting a lot of information about, the actual growing of the vines, because anytime a concept of viticulture was introduced, there was this need to talk about white exceptionalism and how.
Can you give an example? That's really
Okay.
fascinating. Yeah.
So in the strategies for soil management, uh,
Mm.
you know, the instructor loved to show videos about, again, like the way the earth works. And which is hilarious to me because I'm thinking, none of us really know, right? We make observations and we see how often those observations happen again, occurring within certain factors and scenarios, and then we just make guesses. But he'd show these videos, and then when he would get into the history again, he would make mention that there were horrible things done, and I'm using the instructor's words, in order to get to this point. It's another story of European men doing some pretty horrible and awful things to the indigenous peoples here. But the bottom line is we did some pretty awesome things. He'd go on to always quote some philosophical or some strategic, theory about how to, uh, and it sounds like such an oxymoron, but to say like manage Mother Nature, like how do you manage? You probably navigate, nature, but to manage it, or I don't know, how do you manage something you can't control? He'd go into ways that indigenous peoples or people that have more of an understanding on how to navigate certain climates and certain soils and areas, um, and he'd really praise it, but then tell something that a white person has has said at a conference, and then kind of praise that person's stuff, and it would be contrary to the other information. And we got that a lot, where it's like he wanted to go back to doing things in a natural way. And he quoted someone else. I'm sorry, I can't remember who he was quoting, but he said that the person's quote was, look at nature and read a book. And if the two do not agree, then throw away the book.
Hmm.
And that sounded really cool and, woke and hippie and all of these other, all these other like
Yeah, I love that
buzz
quote.
phrases. It sounded great, but then he'd always go back to what a white person was saying to do to kind of control pests, or control the soil, or to in essence
Mm,
force European, and excuse me, because again, I'm not remembering the proper terms, but when we're talking like vitis vinifera
mhm,
or vitis vinifera, however you pronounce it, those are European. I don't know if you would call them species of grapes.
mhm, mhm,
Um, but you're basically still trying to figure out how to force something that is made to grow in Europe on American soil.
mhm.
And
Right.
so when we're talking about, oh, look at Mother Nature, but then we're going to turn around and do the opposite, there was just a lot of contradictory statements. And again, a lot of it based on protecting white and European exceptionalism.
Mm. Yeah. And I'm sure not seen that way at all by the person saying it.
No, I actually think the person wants to be, more inclusive and
Right.
want, but, I think it's the challenge too of, how do you go up against centuries old systems and teachings?
Yeah.
You might want to, but then, oh, they'll beat you back in place. And I know that more than anyone, because in the class, I would introduce, a question or a thought, and I felt like I was being demonized. Like all of a sudden, I turned into the boogeyman.
What like do you remember one of those that where that happened and have a sense of what that like what the reaction was?
So, well, one, and it wasn't just a question about viticulture, but there was a librarian um, in the class. And for some reason, maybe because so much of the class was talking about history, rather than the actual growing of the grapevines. um, she brought up that she was very disturbed with the push to silence certain voices and to get rid of certain books.
Hmm.
And the class was very, the majority of the people in the class agreed that
Hmm.
yes, there should be the spread of information.
Right.
And there was a woman in the class who was also Black, and she kind of looked, because the area that we were taking the class was actually in the news and known for really pushing to stop what people call, or what an author called CRT, critical race theory,
Right.
to stop any type of teaching of history and bringing up race. And so the woman who's Black, she kind of looked at me and at Dennis and my child, and like, are they kidding? Like, this is where they fight hard to make sure that certain voices are muted. And so she kind of brought it up, but very gingerly, and
Hmm.
she actually stopped herself from, like, she clearly did not feel comfortable bringing up that, the hypocrisy in what they were talking about. And so then I raised my hand and told her, I'll go ahead and say what you're too reserved to say. And I said, well, welcome to a little bit of our world as Black people in this country, that, you know, as much as I see in this class, that so much of your narrative is based on things that happened, centuries ago, and you're so proud of uh, the accomplishments that you report from something that you did not do, but then our voices have to be muted when we want to say how something developed culturally or economically or spiritually, whatever it is. We're told, forget about it. That happened a long time ago. And one of the gentlemen in the class chimed in and he said, well, because, people have done things wrong to everybody, everywhere. Everyone's done something wrong to someone.
Mm.
And I said, well, that's true. But when we're talking about specific periods of time, specific scenarios and incidents, then why are we not allowed to focus on that specific period of time where there's clearly, an antagonist, and clearly, why does everything get, all suffering matters when we want to talk about our story? But when you want to tell how your European great great grandpapa came from Italy, and the adversity that he had to face and overcome to become successful, why is that okay to talk about? Why would you like it if I interrupted and said, look, everybody's had to struggle, everybody had to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, someone's had some challenge of some sort? You wouldn't accept that, but yet so many people readily accept that for the Black story.
Hmm.
And then I became the boogeyman, and people wouldn't even sit next to me except for Charity.
Yeah, the reaction of the class, like it, you could feel like an iciness from a lot of people and a lot of discomfort. And I mean, I agreed with what Joyce was saying. So
That's really interesting. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I mean, the funny thing for me, and not funny, but the interesting thing is, it's a class about viticulture, but it's about so much more. Like, I mean, it's we're at that point, and what I hear in the instructor and what you're talking about, the instructor Joyce, is just they're embodying this tension that's happening, I think, in the wine industry, but in larger than the wine industry as well, between this, like, you know, this thing that I love that quote, like observe nature and read a book and throw out the book if they disagree, and then let me teach you these accepted, vitis vinifera viticultural
Exactly.
techniques that are
Mhm.
basically like extractive economics based, agricultural systems that really ignore nature, that it's more about how do we make these things work despite nature. um, and that tension is so fascinating to me to see, it embodied in this person who, probably does want to do well by the world and by you guys to a certain extent. But I I also, I mean, I remember the story that you told about just a comment they made that I think is one of those comments that probably gets made a dozen times a day in some form or another, in some tone or another, in wine circles about my Oaxacans and Zulus. If you can
Yes.
hold that story. Um,
So, and
Talking about it was
the
about trellising,
instructor,
right? It's about
yes, the
trellising, right?
instructor was talking about different trellising systems and canopy management, and was showing this particular trellising system in which the trellis was pretty high, and talked about how much he admired that trellising system and thought it to be a very good strategy given the region that we're in and all of these things. But the problem is that he he said, my Oaxacans are very short. And he goes on to laugh and take his hand like he's demonstrating the height that his Oaxacans are at, and said, so
Yeah.
that wouldn't work. And he said, so unless we go out and get Zulus, we'll have to stay with the trellising system. And my mouth dropped.
I mean, I'm laughing because it's just, I mean, I'd have to cry if I didn't laugh. I
And can
mean,
I tell you, I really believe that this person does not want to talk like that, but it's that
yes,
socialization
right,
in that, it's just so normalized to say, these horrible things, and then it's also normalized not to address it. Like it's almost like, again, I'm demonized if I say something, but I said my Oaxacans, just like that.
right,
And I
right,
think I scared the crap out of him, and he kind of looked at me, and then he realized, yeah, I referred to them as my Oaxacans. And he very nervously laughed, and then he went on with the lesson. But also what it was is not just that he was claiming ownership of people.
right,
It's not like he said, hey, my team, because we'll say my team or my classroom or
right,
something of that, but to say my Oaxacans. And that wasn't the only offensive part. It's that we know that actually some of the tallest people in the world are, if I'm not mistaken, like from like European nations.
yeah. From the Netherlands, I lived there. They're all,
Netherlands. I,
they're all
I absolutely saw a report that the tallest recorded person was from the Netherlands. And
right.
so to say the Zulus, um,
I
it
know, I know,
it showed that, again, when we are talking about labor, field labor,
right,
his mind can only see black and brown people
right,
as laborers, because he very easily could have said, we'll have to get some people from the Netherlands.
right,
But I don't think his mind could wrap around the idea of having European people as, well, white European, because we know that's, we're talking nationality as opposed to the social construct of race, right?
right,
So white European people um, as laborers.
right. Yep, yep.
So
Oh,
these are the things that we had to deal with. I, I still brought cookies. my daughter, my daughter works in a bakery, so oftentimes I'd stop by the bakery and buy cookies and bring them to class. And even the people who didn't like me very much, they grumbled and asked, was that peanut butter?
Right.
And they reluctantly took it, enjoyed it. But it was eye opening, and that's just for the viticulture class. And soon after that one started, we started the wine hospitality class, and I saw a great deal of the same type of mindset and behaviors, and a great deal of it is history.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, that seems where the crunch point keeps coming up in your classes as you've been telling these stories.
Yes. Now it made sense with the wine hospitality to talk about the different regions that the Vitis vinifera varietals came from. So the history in that kind of made sense why, to talk about it so much. Where there was a little shift is that I saw now that it wasn't just the history that they were protecting so fiercely, but also now the definition of what a good wine is.
Mm,
And it's very exclusive, very tightly controlled. And even with the instructor, who this is a different instructor, and this instructor is from Europe, from Italy, I believe, and very, very territorial. And, it's, you definitely see the bias
yeah.
when when we're talking territorial and the type of grape varietals. It's definitely not something that invites a lot of thinking outside of the box or creativity or exploration.
Yeah. So can you give an example of that? I mean, how did that come out in the class? That's I mean, do you have any uh, specific moments where you felt like this exemplifies this sort of very extremely narrow and protected definition or idea?
Well, he definitely we sampled wines, and again, I was a first time drinker, so it was already a lot for me to try to process. Well, what are we talking about here when we are evaluating wines? But there was definitely a bias to lean towards wines from the areas that he comes from or came from. And just how wonderful it was, even when we tasted wines from other regions and thought, no, that probably is something I like more. And it was funny because we giggled a lot because he got angry. He got angry when somebody did not like or particularly care for. Some were more vocal and said, I just don't like this. And what do you mean? And, he'd go on to convince you as to why it tasted fantastic. And, some of us
Wow.
were a little more, we put on the kid gloves and said, well, I kind of prefer this instead. But, he'd say, really? And, I wouldn't think that because, and really gave his take on everything, rather than allow people to explore and develop their palate.
Yeah, like, so did he give you this sense of uh, the ability for taste to be a very largely subjective experience, or or
Uh,
it sounds like the
no,
opposite of that?
he was very into the mindset of, like when we talk new world, old world, he kind of had a lot of those old world values. At least, he explored a few other things, but sounds like he was leaning more toward that, and that, yes, these are the best grapes in the world, and the best thing for wine. And he talked about like the the American, I guess what like the AVAs in California, and he showed us the history on the thing where the Napa Valley cab shocked everyone,
Right.
won that award. Um, and but he kind of laughed a little at the particular AVA that was close to us, and said they're kind of the I don't want to say like the laughing stock, but that's how he described it, the laughing stock of the wine world. Um, and I heard that also in the viticulture class, and subsequently in the enology class that I just finished this semester, is that there's a reputation for that particular AVA that they're not taken very seriously by anyone, including other California
Right.
wine country areas. And
Is that warranted? I mean, do you think that's warranted?
It's definitely partially, I think, because of the history. In the '60s, people were the grapes they were selling were for mass production, and if people were doing something at a better quality, it was like just to make at home. But I remember when I was studying just for like the entry level quartermasters, yeah, everything I read, it was like, and when I talked to people like, oh, where are you from? Oh, I'm from here. Like, where you guys are making, you know, trashy wine. And
Right. Right.
I really had to deprogram myself to start honestly looking at the wines produced here, and you know, why is this bad or not bad? And definitely have had come across some really exceptional wines from this area, actually, after only really trying wines, even living here, but only trying wines from outside the area to learn about wine.
Right. Right.
So we just started off with that negative perception, and I guess it's hard to break out of it. But also,
Yeah.
so much of the area, it it a lot of places, it really just seems like they are just making wine to make money, to just profit off tourism. And so I think that's that
Right.
aspect too, of the people who are really trying to express terroir, make really great wine, is extremely small production. And unfortunately, a lot of those people are the ones that people look at them as like, eh, you know.
Right.
and I agree. The more that I was learning, I really do see that not all of it is just a marketing or just a, strictly a control freak type of thing that, because that's my region. I see the art. I see the knowledge and tradition and the things that go into, this thing that kind of blends both art and science
Right.
together, and it is something to be respected. It's not, there's a lot of the crap is made up. There's no politically correct way to say it. A lot of the crap is made up and it's very
Yeah.
subjective, but I can see with the hard work and the, really trying to figure things out, and how do we best express qualities of this grape in this thing called wine.
Right.
um, but again, what's this thing with saying that your art is the only good art
Right.
and no
Right.
one else has good art? Country music is the only good genre of music and nothing else, not classical, not, pop, not hip hop. That would be ridiculous. And so even with,
Yeah.
with other, when we're talking wine, why are we not exploring the grapes that grow naturally here and also going outside of grapes?
Yeah. But no, well, you just opened a can of worms for me, but in a good way, in a great way. But it is, I mean, that again, it's going back to that definition of wine. Like why I love that. Thinking of wine as an art, and we don't, I mean, are right. Is there only one form of art? Like obviously we're well beyond that. on the planet, and yet wine, for whatever reason, there's so many people who think it's not weird to defend this one subjective style. This one. I mean, it's not like it's not a monolith. There's a lot of different cultures within Europe of wine. And they are beautiful. They're beautiful, like you said. Like, I mean, they're worthy of admiration, respect. They're beautiful. They're
Mhm.
delicious. Like, but they aren't the only one in the world. They're not the oldest ones in the world. And it's not the best either. Like, regardless of what those people think.
Right.
And yeah, and yet
So
to
that's where
talk
I
to
think
any,
the
yeah,
commercialism comes in, because again, I'm feeling this want to explore outside of what has been the norm for centuries. And from back in Europe to carried here into the Americas. But what do you do when there's somebody with a big stick saying you better produce this crap that hey, we have these women that want to come here with their big platform shoes on and their summer dresses, and they want to yell woo and take selfies, and they don't care about really what went into it. They just know that, hey, this is what we heard about, and this is what we're coming to be able to put on our Instagram page. And you have to produce those things. And, there, I guess you don't have a lot of wiggle room financially, because from what I'm seeing and being behind the scenes on some field trips and labs, is that there's a lot of exploitation of
Hmm.
people. And even when I think, even the vineyards, like a lot of those vineyards are on stolen land that was passed down to generations, but nonetheless stolen land, and then exploited labor. There's, in my opinion, there's no way that they could be profitable without exploiting illegal immigrant labor.
mm-hmm, yeah,
And so when you already kind of don't have a lot of wiggle room, even though you cheat and steal and do some other things that go on, where, clearly money is the big driving factor in this. And then they just don't have the willingness to explore, because you have to have that bottom line coming in consistently if
right.
you want to keep your job.
Well, now, I mean, I, before I get just lured into these bigger discussions, and I want to keep us
Do
focused a
I need
little
to bring
bit.
you cookies now?
No, this is fantastic. No, this is my cookie. I, I mean, I just can see us going in so many different directions. I will just jump back to you saying, and not that I want to talk about this, but your idea of, like, maybe opening up the definition of wine for things that grow locally that aren't grapes. Like, where did you start thinking about those kind of things? I mean, for somebody who's new to wine, like, I mean, I'll just use myself. I'm not going to blame anybody else, but for me, for wine, it was years of me looking at the, learning about the vinifera cultures of Europe, and until they finally started to unravel for me. But for a long time, I was just so eager to memorize all the different things that you can memorize in your, court of master sommelier and wine spirits education trust training, and pass all the tests, and be smart about quote unquote wine. And it took years for me to start to think outside of that. So
Mhm.
where did these questions arise for you? Like, how did you so quickly start to see, a broader scope of things? Like, where did that come from?
I guess just hearing people talk about wine. Again, I'm not a drinker until just recently now, tasting wines. But I wasn't a beer drinker, any type of spirits. And but of course, the most familiar wine is the grapes. That's what we know to be wine. But I'd always hear someone say, "Oh yeah, something something watermelon wine," or
Mm-hmm.
peach or something. And, I really didn't pay attention to the conversations because, again, as a non-drinker, that didn't matter to me unless I was just thinking like, okay, do I want to buy something as a gift for someone? But once I got into the classes, and so here's the part, and being silly, I asked the instructor for the wine hospitality class because, again, I have no knowledge. And when they're telling us, yes, I'm picking up, notes of strawberry and or fig or whatever it is, right? Black berry fruits and things like that. I raised my hand and I said, so do they mix those things?
Right.
Oh my goodness. If ever he gave me like this stare that I needed to be in the corner with a dunce cap. He goes, you're joking, right? I wasn't. I really thought when they would say like, oh yeah, there's like, I'm tasting, apple or peach or pineapple or something. I really thought they were mixing in these other fruit juices.
Yeah, and then
And
why
so
wouldn't they?
after that, I started asking, well, why don't you? Because hey, I love other types of fruits, so I would want to know, why are we not? And they said they do, but that's not what we're talking about here.
Well, and this is the really interesting observation that you just made me. I mean, I'm if I can put it in terms that I'm thinking about, it's sort of like in the course of most of our lives, we encounter this wide diversity, I think, or a much wider diversity of wine. Well, maybe that's not true. It depends on where you come from and things like that. But I know personally for me, like you said, you encountered like peach and watermelon wines, and like where I grew up, it was like strawberry and blueberry wines and all these fruit cherry wines and stuff like that. But then when I started to formally study wine, those things were completely absent, and not only absent, they were excluded. And there was only one
Right,
kind of thing that you could study and learn about that was worthy of studying and learn about. And so
right,
there was this, yeah. So there's this um, dichotomy, this split between your real lived experience on the ground as a person going through the world, and then this theoretical, like what is acceptable and what is the right kind of wine to to study and learn about. And it's very, they're two divorced things. I mean, you encounter the grape wines too, but that's not the only thing you encounter. That's a really interesting thing. I
and to hear again, there were people in the class, much like Charity, that they work in the wine industry, or they were somehow involved in the wine industry, as growers, as even home winemakers, or working for local wineries. And there's this desire that was constantly expressed to carve out their special, identity, their like, is the word like a niche, to say, hey, this is what we're going to be known for, instead of just chasing after being a disrespected kind of,
right,
uh,
right,
a cheap imitation of someone else's
yeah,
identity. How do we carve out our own? And so I love that question. And so when I would present ideas like, why are we not looking at the native grapes here and figuring out how to express the qualities of those grapes in this fermented drink called wine? And but it's kind of like, well, no. And then they'd kind of go against themselves. They
right, right,
present
right.
this desire,
And trying to
but then,
redefine themselves, they're still
yeah,
just doing it in
yeah,
reference
like I'm the
to,
one that's
yeah,
going, come on, guys. Like, I don't know if you've ever watched Pippi Longstocking, but she had her little friend Annika and whatever the brother's name. And she was always saying, come on, you guys, leave the yard. Let's go explore, and go somewhere. And it's like, they're always wanting to go outside of it, but very, very afraid to even discuss going outside of it.
yeah.
It's like almost like you're shamed to get back in that box.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I think your region isn't alone that way. I mean, obviously, we're carefully trying to avoid saying the name of your region, but I'll just say, somewhere that you guys aren't, like the Finger Lakes region of New York. I mean, they have bent over backwards, and they use so many chemicals to be able to grow European grapes in a place where European grapes absolutely do terribly. And most of the time, every once in a while, you get a good vintage out of some European grapes there. Specific, one or two varieties do okay every once in a blue moon, but most of the time, it's just like you have to do so much to make them work, and at the same time, there are beautiful, like amazing, unlimited, like just limitless varieties of you know feral pear and apple trees growing wild all around there that make, I think, some of the world's best cider if done well. And there are some producers there who are showing that. And I'm like, guys, just or there's like the forests are full of native grapes that clearly grow wild without any help at all from humans. And if we just didn't have that prejudice, this is a region that could just be booming with like tons of amazing fruit that just doesn't fit into that vinifera model. So it's that thing. Like I know that it has to do with everything that you're talking about. It's this idea that there is only one kind of wine, and it can't come from these other kind of grapes or these other kinds of fruit. And if it's not this one kind of wine, then it's not worth buying. It's not worth talking about. It's not worth studying. Yeah, I think
So
it's an idea
here,
that needs to die, in my opinion.
yeah, when, with the enology class that I just finished, we go to different wineries, kind of like, to observe the behind the scenes. And I just remember looking at Dennis and saying, it's like they're freaking making Kool-Aid. And I later, when we got in the car, I said, I was thinking, especially after hearing all the history of things, that, it's just these like super brilliant people that are like born with this like gift, and like nobody else has it, and like, they wake up every morning and they tenderly kiss each grape, and and sing songs to them at night, and this wonderful wine comes from it. And when we went behind the scenes, I was like, the amount of manipulation
Mhm.
Yeah,
that has to go into making this product is ridiculous. And I remember reading a few that they'd have us kind of look at articles and give a summary or an idea of what the article was talking about. And some of them would talk about the naturalists versus, the more modern winemakers. And again, there's something valuable in all of it.
sure.
We can't control um nature, and sometimes nature, she dishes out things that, we go, oh darn, we're going to have to fix this and fix that if we want to, meet our demand for this particular product, or to make sure that this crop is not, wasted. So the scientific part of, adding things to kind of correct something that didn't go the way that you would hope, I see a lot of great things in that as well. But now I understand too why the naturalists are very defensive about their strategies and skills, because it, again, it's an art, and it is something that takes a while to learn and figure out. And so it kind of sucks when you take so much time to study something and figure things out, and then someone else just says, yeah, let me pour a little bit of this and do that to it, and do it's kind of like Dexter's Laboratory, if anybody has children, and this little guy in the lab. I could see where both sides have their argument. But back to the whole thing is, why is that the only argument? Why are we still only saying, Vitis vinifera? Why are we not saying, hey, that same attitude that, what you like, there's consumers, for that particular thing. What about other fruits? What about even the grapes that are native to these lands? Why can't we try to see what, if you're such naturalists, then wouldn't you say the natural thing to do is to use the grapes or the fruits that need the least amount of manipulation from this area? I don't know, just a question.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Well, um, just to give you an open forum for any other insights, that came out of taking this experience for you. I mean, did you have a best moment, a worst moment, a thing that made you see things that you'd like to see change, or something that excited you, in terms of, just in wine and even just with wine education in general?
So I know it sounds like I had such a horrible experience, and I'd have to say there were horrible moments, but there were good things about I met people. It introduced me to a world that I was unfamiliar with. And so anytime I'm learning something, that's just pretty awesome for me. And even with some of the, very exclusive mindsets, it was still interesting to hear the histories. It's still, again, the art and the science of it all. There's something to be respected there. So those are kind of the best things. And that I met my friend Charity there. um, the worst that I'm still experiencing is that I'm definitely seeing that as a Black person in the class, there's in some cases unintentional, but in some cases a very intentional um, discouraging Black
Mm.
people from even wanting to participate or enter into this world. I can ask a question based on something a speaker brought up, and all of a sudden there's this big ring around the rosy dance to avoid answering what I think is a pretty simple and logical question. Um, they ask us, to give you an example, they often ask us at the beginning of the semester, whatever class we're taking, to introduce ourselves and why we are taking the class. And
Mm.
I said I was interested in, maybe starting a small vineyard and learning how to make wine. And one of the speakers, who is part of like a small wine growers group, she went on to, not in response to my introduction. This is after another 10, 12 people introduced themselves and why they're getting into it. She told her story and went on to say that she does it as a hobby, but it is an extremely expensive hobby. And she went on and on and on about how expensive this hobby is, and you might want to think twice. So when I asked her, because I said I was thinking about doing it, can you kind of give me an idea of what those costs are as a hobby? And she did everything in the world to avoid answering that question, and went on to tell jokes, well, you know what they say in the wine world, if you want to make $1 million, you better invest too, ha ha ha. And first of all, we weren't talking about commercial or business,
Right.
wine. We were talking about as a hobby. And I said, if you don't mind asking, because you are the person bringing up how expensive it is, you know, what is the size of your operations? About how many vines do you have, and how much production do you get? And, how does that look as far as how many bottles of wine? Oh, it was like pulling a impacted wisdom tooth, with a pair of pliers.
You
And
went
that,
from student to dentist.
my goodness, it was awful, and she just did not want to answer. And finally she'd answer that, and then I'd say, okay, so kind of what's the average cost? And she just kept telling me, it's very expensive, very expensive. And I mean, then I felt like I was in a battle. And finally, she answered. And it really wasn't that expensive. Yes, it cost a nice little penny, but it wasn't like the way she was talking. I was thinking for just, and we weren't talking facilities. We weren't talking like buildings or anything. We were just talking about the actual, things to ferment, to crush, to press, and to store,
Right.
bottle, things like that. And she was saying it was somewhere around, $5,000 to $7,000.
Right. Right.
But I was thinking, my goodness, what you like? I thought for a minute she was going to tell me like 150,000 or something that
Right. Right.
and I thought, okay, I don't know what that's about. But I noticed whenever I'd ask a question, she went all around the world and back, before answering it. But when someone else asked a question, said they had a vineyard or that they have a small wine production equipment, and asked her a question, she'd immediately offer up the answers,
Hmm.
explain to them things, give them additional resources where they could. And I don't think I was being sensitive, because I'm very mindful not to, just think everything is race, when actually, let me go ahead and say, in this country, yeah, mostly everything is race. That's it was woven into the tapestry of this country, right?
Right.
Every little application, everything. We could have casual conversation, and I can say something as simple as, oh, this woman, but instead of saying this woman walked by in Target, we'll say, oh, this Asian woman walked by, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the story. Like, it has no context. So yeah, race is very much a part of it, but definitely there was not a willingness to answer questions for me or for Dennis, who also is Black, and the other young lady that was in the class. She went to one of those meetings, and she just felt so uncomfortable, that she didn't go back. I think she did go back one time with
She went back
Charity.
with me.
Yeah,
Ah.
so it's like, we almost need white protection. Like, come on, Charity.
Yep.
I feel like when Dave Chappelle said, like, whenever you get in the car, you always need that white friend with you in case the police pull you over.
Right.
Mhm.
That was like
Mhm.
Charity to us. And even it was interesting, there was a conversation in which the other Black student, when she wanted to bring up, something back to the whole history thing, and voices being muted, once I spoke up and she saw how uncomfortable to angry and everything within that range that the white students in our class, demonstrated through what they said or their facial expressions or their body language. She then kind of turned on me a little bit to, try to make sure to soften. And, I had to have a discussion with her privately and say, please don't ever do that. If you're uncomfortable with expressing yourself, that's okay. But don't go against what my feeling or my narrative is. And she said, well, yeah, that's kind of a habit to make them feel comfortable.
Mm.
Mhm.
Mm.
And so you almost feel like, okay, you kind of stick your big toe in the swimming pool to gauge the temperature. But once she saw that it was not a safe place for us to really be, then she turned to, hey, I'm the cool one, I'm the good one.
Mm.
And they immediately, she told me after I left, they all ran to her, to get her take on, on things, because they saw her as the safe Black person in the class
Mm.
that will uphold their narrative.
Right. Right.
So it was very interesting. And And
Um,
you're going, gosh, this is just about wine, but it is so
right.
representative. Even
Right.
when you take the race stuff out of it, just the exclusivity of it all.
Yeah.
Just even in the type of grapes, like what is considered good there. And so my last question to my instructor in the wine hospitality classes, there's so much about terroir, and we have the best because of our soil, our climate. Nothing else is
Right.
good, only this. Well, what the heck are y'all going to do when this thing called climate change keeps spanking your butts?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What's going to be your selling point at that? Because right now we're seeing it right before our eyes. This climate, and the weather, it's doing things that are unprecedented, and it's causing a lot of issues in that vineyard.
Yeah.
So now what?
Yeah. Those places that were, yeah, these, yeah, it's really interesting to say that. That's a great point. Yeah. Yeah. You're not safe. Is
Yeah,
that, which
things
is,
change.
I think
Uh-huh.
what I like about you. um, uh, and why I think I went, what I was very excited to share your voice, because it's not a safe, you're not asking the safe questions. So thanks for that. I really appreciate that. um, and is there anything else before we wrap up?
Yeah, I just want to say that this is an exciting time. It is a time to seize, instead of to fear. And that goes for even the people who have the traditional winemaking, concepts, and because on this last class for the enology class, one of my fellow students asked, well, what is the future of wine? And I thought, what an odd question, but it again demonstrates this, we think there's just one answer. It demonstrates that unwillingness to, be creative and think outside the box. And the instructor was, shrugging their shoulders and kind of like, I don't know, and started kind of going into some of the problems they see in the vineyard and ways to kind of resolve them. And I just said, look, it's what we make it.
Mm, I like that. That's lovely. Well, thank
So
you guys.
we'll leave it
Yeah.
at that before I open mouth and insert foot.
um, Charity, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, so I think part of why things are so homogenous right now is it's so hard to find easily accessible information about like branching out. Like that's something that listening to your podcast and even taking the viticulture class, just learning more about regenerative agriculture, looking more into that, being like, okay, there's, way different ways of doing things, but trying to look more into about, well, how could we, accommodate more indigenous plants and just not being able to find that information. So I think a big part of why we're so entrenched in the way things have been is there's not a lot of easily accessible information about how to even start change, or people who are doing things differently, like just having to dig so hard to find information about these growers and these producers and how things they're doing differently, and how that information just seems like it's kind of like um, just you have to like know someone to then find out about like
Mm.
what's going on. And so I'm not quite sure,
Yeah, it's a vicious circle
yeah,
of like,
how
yeah,
to
the entrenched culture begets the entrenched culture, because it's so hard to break that circle.
yeah,
Um,
how to even start making this information more easily accessible. I mean, that's something I've been wondering about. And for my side, I'm like, man, I need to just learn, chemistry and biology and genetics just so we can just figure it out for ourselves. Like,
Mhm, mhm.
yeah, that's great. I mean, it's tough too. It's yeah, like it puts a lot of weight on your shoulders to to be able to do that. Well, I mean, thank you guys. Hopefully, you're sharing your story, Joyce, and you too, Charity, will help get some of this information out and at least inspire people to maybe be more thoughtful if they are
Hmm.
instructing with their own wine education when they're talking about wine to other people, how they're communicating about wine. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that people who have wine knowledge educate, and it's not always just in a formal way. Sometimes it's through marketing, sometimes it's through, you know, tasting rooms, sometimes it's, just in the way that they talk to other people about wine. So I hope what you guys have said, what you've shared, Joyce, about your experiences, open people up to be more thoughtful about what they're doing with that. So I really appreciate you sharing. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing our voice, and thanks for all your episodes. Like, that's for in terms of my education has helped so much. Like, really appreciate the podcast.
Awesome. Well, there we go. Thank you so much for listening. If you are a young person or you're new to wine, I just want you to know how valuable your perspective and questions are. I hope you've seen that with Joyce, somebody who just stepped in from the outside and was like, wait, what's going on here? And it's those questions like, what the heck are you doing, that help us to grow and help us to see ourselves from outside perspective. So the fact that you don't know much might actually be a really amazing asset to the wine world. So I just wanted to give that encouragement to anybody who's new, getting started, falling in love with wine and trying to figure it out. So many things, so many questions that you have while you're figuring it out might be helping me and others figure it out. So keep asking those questions and don't be afraid to speak up.